Hey guys, tonight we're heading to the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth. A village where your breath doesn't just fog. It literally freezes midair and falls to the ground with a tinkling sound the locals call the whisper of the stars. We're talking about Oymyakon, Yakutia in the Sakha Republic of Russia, where the thermometer hit minus 71.2 degrees Celsius in 1924 and where, for 20 hours a day during winter, the sun doesn't even bother showing up. You're about to experience what it means to live where exposed skin freezes in under a minute, where cars never turn off from October to March, and where stepping outside without the right gear means you probably won't survive long enough to regret it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing how we're all scattered across the globe, finding comfort in these strange stories together. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You step off the small propeller plane onto the packed snow of Oymyakon's airstrip, and the cold doesn't hit you. It detonates. Within 3 seconds, the moisture in your nostrils freezes into tiny ice crystals that crack with each inhale. Your lungs tighten, rejecting air that feels more like shards of glass than oxygen. The metal zipper on your jacket is already too cold to touch with bare fingers, and you haven't even left the runway yet. Welcome to the Pole of Cold. Oymyakon sits in a valley in Russia's Sakha Republic, about 750 kilometers northeast of Yakutsk, the regional capital. The village's name comes from the Yakut word "kiam," meaning unfrozen water, a reference to a nearby thermal spring where reindeer herders once watered their animals. The irony isn't lost on you as you stand in a place where pretty much everything else stays frozen for 8 months straight. About 500 people call this village home, though that number swells slightly in summer when relatives visit and immediately remember why they left. The settlement sits in a valley approximately 750 meters above sea level, surrounded by mountains that trap cold air like a bowl holds soup. This geographical quirk creates a temperature inversion. Cold air sinks and pools here, unable to escape, creating a natural freezer that never quite shuts off. During the peak of winter, from December through February, you're living in what scientists call a continental subarctic climate, though that sterile term doesn't capture the raw hostility of the environment. Your guide, a Sakha man named Mikhail whose weathered face suggests he's anywhere between 40 and 70, grins at your obvious discomfort. First time? He asks in accented English, though your chattering jaw makes answering difficult. He's wearing what looks like multiple animal pelts stitched together. Reindeer fur turned inward, with an outer layer of something darker you can't immediately identify. Later, you'll learn it's horsehide, treated with a mixture of fish oil and ash to make it windproof. His boots rise almost to his knees, made from the leg skin of reindeer, with the fur also facing inward and stuffed with dried grass for insulation. He looks like he stepped out of a different century, and functionally he has. Thermometer broke this morning, Mikhail says cheerfully, gesturing toward a traditional mercury thermometer mounted outside a small wooden building. The red line stops at minus 68 degrees Celsius, not because that's the current temperature, but because that's where the mercury freezes solid and stops being useful. Probably minus 71, maybe minus 72 today. Good weather. His definition of good will require serious recalibration on your part. You learn quickly that Oymyakon holds the distinction of being the coldest permanently inhabited place on Earth, competing only with Verkhoyansk, another Sakha town about 600 kilometers away. In 1924, Soviet scientist Sergei Abrachev recorded that minus 71.2 degrees Celsius measurement that still stands as the coldest reliably measured temperature in a permanently inhabited location. There are whispers of a minus 77.8 degrees Celsius reading from 1938, but historians still argue whether that measurement was accurate or the result of a malfunctioning instrument. Either way, you're standing in a place where the temperature regularly drops below what your body was ever designed to survive. The village itself looks almost provisional, as if the inhabitants expect to abandon it any day now, though many families have been here for generations. Low-slung wooden houses hunker against the landscape, painted in faded blues, greens, and yellows that provide the only color against the overwhelming white. Smoke rises from chimneys in perfectly vertical columns, When it's this cold, there's no wind, because the air itself is too heavy to move easily. The silence is profound. No birds, no insects, no rustling leaves. Just the creak of your boots on snow and the weird tinkling sound of your frozen breath falling around your feet like microscopic wind chimes. Mikhail leads you toward his home, a walk that should take 5 minutes but feels like 50. Don't touch metal, he warns. Not with skin. He points to a younger man across the dirt road. Well, the frozen dirt road, who's working on a truck. The man wears mittens so thick they look like boxing gloves, and he's using wooden handles attached to his tools. Last winter, tourists touched door handle with bare hand. Mikhail continues. Skin froze to metal instantly. When he pulled away, he makes a ripping gesture. Left skin behind. Very painful. Very stupid. You notice there are no power lines above ground. Everything's buried deep in the permafrost, insulated and heated to prevent the lines themselves from becoming brittle and snapping. The few vehicles you see are running, engines growling, exhaust creating clouds of white vapor that immediately freeze and drift to the ground as ice crystals. Nobody turns off their car from October to April, because if you do, the engine oil turns into something with the consistency of peanut butter, and the battery dies within minutes. If your car stops running, it becomes a 2-ton metal sculpture until spring. How long is it dark each day? You manage to ask, though talking is difficult when your facial muscles are rapidly going numb. December, January, sun comes up maybe 3 hours, very low on horizon. Not really daylight, more like long sunset, then dark again. 21 hours of darkness. Mikhail says this the way someone else might describe a cloudy afternoon. Makes people crazy sometimes, especially Russians who move here for work. Saka people were used to it. Our ancestors lived here for thousands of years. And they did. The Saka people, also called Yakuts, are Turkic-speaking horse and cattle breeders who migrated to this region from the south around the 13th or 14th century. Historians still argue whether it was before or after the Mongol invasions pushed various groups northward. They adapted to conditions that would have killed most populations, developing a culture specifically calibrated for extreme cold and darkness. They brought horses with them, which is insane when you think about it, and those horses adapted too, growing winter coats so thick they look like small mobile haystacks. You finally reach Mikhail's home, and he pushes open the outer door into a small vestibule, essentially an airlock designed to keep the interior warm. There's an inner door beyond it, and between the two is a space where frost has accumulated in intricate patterns on every surface. Never open both doors at same time, he instructs. Cold air rushes in, warm air rushes out. Can drop inside temperature by 20 degrees in seconds. The moment you step through that inner door, the warmth hits you like a physical force. It's almost painfully hot after the exterior cold, probably around 25 degrees Celsius, which feels tropical. Your glasses fog instantly. Ice that's formed on your eyelashes begins to melt, dripping into your eyes. The ice in your nostrils liquefies, and you have the undignified experience of your nose suddenly running like a faucet. Mikhail's wife, Sarjalana, looks up from a large wood stove that dominates one corner of the single main room. She's stirring something in a massive pot, and the smell is challenging. You'll learn later it's a traditional dish involving fermented horse milk and frozen fish, but right now your sensory system is too overloaded to process it. She nods at you, not unfriendly, just reserved in the way people are when outsiders show up to gawk at their daily reality. The interior is smaller than you expected, maybe 30 square meters total, with walls at least 30 centimeters thick. There are no internal walls, just one big room with sleeping areas curtained off. A single electric light bulb hangs from the ceiling, but it's off. Mikhail uses kerosene lamps to save electricity, which is expensive and unreliable this far from any major grid. The windows are triple-paned and tiny, designed to let in a bit of light while losing as little heat as possible. Still, frost creeps up the inside of the glass in feathery patterns. You feel the cold yet? Mikhail asks with a smile. In your bones, I mean, not just on your skin. You're about to say no, but then you realize you're shivering violently despite the warmth. Your core temperature has dropped, and your body is frantically trying to generate heat. Your fingers and toes ache as blood flow returns to them, the beginning stages of what could have been frostbite if you'd stayed outside much longer. And you were out there for less than 10 minutes, fully clothed in modern cold weather gear. Mikhail pours you tea from a samovar. Strong, black, and hot enough to hurt your throat going down. People ask me why we live here, he says, settling onto a bench covered in reindeer hide. I tell them, this is home. My father born here. His father's father. We know this cold. We know this darkness. Outsiders think it's surviving. For us, it's living. And that's the thing you're beginning to understand. This isn't a survival story in the way you initially thought. People clinging desperately to existence in a hostile environment. This is a culture that has made peace with conditions that seem impossible. The Saka people don't just endure Oymyakon's winter. They've built a civilization around it, one that's lasted centuries through wars, Soviet collectivization, and the slow encroachment of modernity. Outside, the brief window of twilight is already fading. It's 2 p.m., and the sun is giving up for the day, sinking below the mountains without having ever really risen. The temperature will drop even further tonight, probably down to minus 75 degrees Celsius, maybe colder. Your internal clock is already confused, your body uncertain whether it should be awake or asleep, and you've been here for less than an hour. You're beginning to realize that surviving at minus 71 degrees Celsius with 20 hours of darkness isn't just about having warm clothes and a heated house. It's about rewiring your entire understanding of what's livable, what's normal, and what the human body and mind can actually adapt to. The people of Oymyakon aren't performing some extreme sport or testing their limits. This is Tuesday. This is breakfast. This is taking the kids to school and checking on the horses and deciding whether it's warm enough to fix the fence or if that should wait until it gets above minus 60 degrees Celsius. Mikhail refills your tea and nods toward the window, where darkness is rapidly swallowing the last traces of light. Welcome to winter, he says. Only 4 more months. For more months, you try not to think about it too hard. The first week, you think you're handling the darkness just fine. Sure, the sun barely makes an appearance, just a pale suggestion of light smearing the southern horizon for a couple of hours around midday, but you've got electric lights, you've got the warm glow from the wood stove, and you've got a headlamp for when you venture outside. How bad could it be? By day 10, you understand that you were adorably naive. The darkness in Oymyakon isn't just the absence of light. It's a presence, a weight, a thing that presses against your windows and seeps under doors and fills your lungs with each breath. You wake up in darkness. You eat breakfast in darkness. The brief smudge of twilight around noon feels less like daytime and more like the universe acknowledging that, yes, technically the sun still exists somewhere beyond the curve of the planet, though it seems to have forgotten about you specifically. Your internal clock, that ancient biological mechanism calibrated over millions of years of human evolution to run on a roughly 24-hour cycle synced to sunrise and sunset, is staging a full rebellion. Your body has no idea when it's supposed to be awake or asleep. You find yourself exhausted at 2 p.m. and wide awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling while Mikhail's family snores peacefully around you. Their bodies long since adapted to this lightless existence. The scientific term for what you're experiencing is circadian rhythm disruption, and it's wreaking havoc on pretty much every system in your body. Your brain produces melatonin, the hormone that makes you sleepy, based on light exposure. In normal conditions, light hitting your retinas suppresses melatonin production, keeping you alert during the day. As darkness falls, melatonin levels rise, preparing you for sleep. But here, in this perpetual twilight and darkness, your brain is dumping melatonin into your bloodstream pretty much constantly, leaving you in a fog of exhaustion that never quite resolves into actual restful sleep. Sarjalana notices you nodding off over your lunch, a bowl of stroganina, which is raw frozen fish sliced paper-thin and eaten with salt. You need more light, she says in halting English, pointing to your eyes. She rummages in a drawer and produces what looks like a small plastic visor with LED lights built into it. From Yakutsk, Dr. Say used 30 minutes each morning. Helps brain. You're looking at a light therapy device, the kind used to treat seasonal affective disorder, SAD, in places with harsh winters. The irony of treating a biological problem caused by geography with a piece of technology isn't lost on you, but you're desperate enough to try anything. That evening, or morning, or afternoon, you've honestly lost track. You strap the thing on and sit bathed in artificial blue-white light that's supposed to simulate daylight. It helps marginally, though you can't shake the feeling that you're trying to convince your brain that everything's normal while reality screams the opposite. What nobody prepared you for is how the darkness affects your sense of time itself. Without the natural anchors of sunrise and sunset, hours blur together into an undifferentiated mess. You check your watch constantly, surprised each time by what it tells you. Feels like you've been awake for 3 hours, but it's been 7. Or you're convinced it must be nearly midnight, and it's actually 4 p.m. The psychological term for this is temporal disorientation, and it's disarmingly unsettling. Mikhail's 10-year-old daughter, Adalina, seems completely unfazed by the darkness. She does her homework by lamplight, plays with a battered doll, and occasionally ventures outside to check on the family's 3 horses, who stand in their shelter with frost coating their impossibly thick winter coats. "Don't you miss the sun?" you ask her one evening. She looks at you like you've asked if she misses summer rain in the middle of summer rain. "Sun comes back in spring," she says matter-of-factly. Always does. Her acceptance is total, uncomplicated by the existential unease that's gnawing at you. She was born into this rhythm. Her body, her mind, her entire framework for understanding the world includes 4 months of darkness as a basic feature, not a bug. But you're discovering that your mind isn't adapting nearly as gracefully. Around week 3, you notice that your mood has shifted into something darker, heavier. Tasks that would normally feel simple, getting dressed, eating a meal, having a conversation, require enormous effort, as if you're moving through water. You're irritable, snapping at Mikhail over small things and then feeling guilty about it. Your appetite has changed, you're craving carbohydrates and fats almost desperately, and your body seems to be trying to pack on weight despite the fact that you're not exactly hibernating. This is seasonal affective disorder in its full glory, and it affects somewhere between 10 and 20% of people in northern latitudes to some degree. The lack of sunlight reduces serotonin production in your brain, serotonin being the neurotransmitter that regulates mood, appetite, and sleep. Meanwhile, the excess melatonin makes you sluggish and sleepy. The combination creates a biochemical recipe for depression that no amount of willpower can simply think away. What's fascinating and slightly terrifying is that the Saka people experience this too, but they've developed cultural adaptations to manage it. Mikhail explains one evening, as you're all gathered around the stove, that winter is traditionally a time for indoor work, storytelling, and social connection. In old times, families would gather for whole winter, he says. Tell stories, make tools, sew clothes. Always together. Darkness easier when not alone. The isolation you're learning amplifies everything. Oymyakon is connected to the outside world by a single road, the Road of Bones, named for the prisoners who died building it during Stalin's Gulag era, and that road becomes nearly impassable during the worst of winter. Internet is spotty at best. Cell service is a joke. You're cut off from the constant stream of information and connection that usually structures your days, and that absence creates a void that the darkness seems to fill. Historians still argue whether pre-industrial societies experienced SAD at the same rates modern people do, or whether our current lifestyles, with indoor work, artificial lighting, and year-round food abundance, have actually made us more vulnerable to seasonal changes rather than less. There's something darkly amusing about the idea that modern comfort has made you weaker, less capable of handling the natural rhythms of the planet. Around week 4, you experience your first true moment of panic. You're outside, midday, during the brief window when the sky lightens from black to a deep purple gray. You're standing in the middle of the village, watching your breath crystallize and fall, and you suddenly can't remember what the sun looks like. Not as a concept, but as an actual sensory experience. The feeling of warmth on your skin, the brightness that makes you squint, the way shadows work when cast by direct light. The memory is there intellectually, but it's lost all sensory detail, and the absence terrifies you in a way you can't quite articulate. You mention this to Mikhail later, expecting him to dismiss it as outsider weakness, but his expression softens. "Yes, he says quietly. Happens to everyone first winter. You forget sun is real. Feels like darkness is all there ever was, all there ever will be. Brain playing tricks. He pours more tea. The ritual of warmth and hospitality that punctuates every difficult conversation here. This is when people break if they're going to break. When darkness stops being temporary and starts feeling permanent. The suicide rate in northern Russia spikes during the polar night. This isn't discussed much in official statistics, partly because mental health remains stigmatized and partly because the numbers are genuinely grim. Studies from Scandinavia, where they're more open about this stuff, show that the winter months in regions above the Arctic Circle see significant increases in depression, anxiety, and self-harm. The darkness doesn't just affect your mood. It fundamentally alters your brain chemistry, and some people simply can't compensate. But there's a quirky, almost perverse adaptation that some people experience. They start to enjoy it. Around week 5, you notice moments where the darkness feels less oppressive and more cozy, intimate. The world contracts to the warm sphere around the stove, the golden glow of lamplight, the muffled quiet that comes with deep cold and deeper darkness. There's something almost womb-like about it, a retreat from the demands of visibility and activity. Psychologists have documented this phenomenon. They call it hygge in Danish contexts. Though the Saka people don't have a specific word for it. It's the cultivation of coziness and comfort in the face of hostile external conditions. And it becomes a survival strategy. You find yourself looking forward to the evening gatherings around the stove, to the simple pleasure of hot tea and conversation in the lamplight, to the feeling of being warm and safe while the world outside tries its best to kill you. Your body is changing too. You've gained weight despite being more physically active than usual. There's always wood to chop, snow to clear, ice to break. Your body is desperately trying to insulate itself, packing on fat in a way that feels almost autonomous. You're also sleeping more or trying to, your body attempting to hibernate even though you're conscious that you can't. Human beings aren't physiologically equipped for true hibernation, but your endocrine system seems to be giving it a shot anyway. The strangest effect is on your perception of cold itself. That first day, when you stepped off the plane into minus 71 degrees Celsius, it felt apocalyptic, unsurvivable. Now, 6 weeks in, you find yourself stepping outside in minus 65 degrees Celsius and thinking, oh, it's actually quite nice today. Your baseline has shifted so dramatically that anything above minus 60 degrees Celsius starts to feel almost balmy. Mikhail laughs when you mention this. Next year, you'll be complaining that minus 55 is too warm for good ice fishing, he says, and you can't tell if he's joking. What you're experiencing is a process called cold adaptation, or more specifically, habituation to extreme cold. Your body is becoming more efficient at conserving heat. Your blood vessels constrict more quickly to preserve core temperature. Your shivering response becomes more effective, and your subjective tolerance increases. But it's not just physical. Your psychological threshold for what counts as unbearable has shifted. Comfort is relative, and you're recalibrating. The darkness, though, that's harder to adapt to. Even Saka people who've lived here their entire lives admit that January is hard. When the darkness is deepest and the cold most severe and spring is still so impossibly far away. There's a traditional saying Mikhail teaches you, if you survive January, you'll survive anything. It's meant to be encouraging, but it mostly makes you aware that you're only about halfway through the worst of it. One night or day, the distinction has become meaningless. You wake at 4 a.m. to find Sarjalana sitting by the window, staring out at the darkness. She doesn't notice you at first, and you watch her face in the lamplight. She looks tired, deeply so, with the kind of weariness that sleep doesn't fix. When she finally notices you, she doesn't seem embarrassed. Waiting for stars, she says simply. Clouds been covering them for 3 days. Miss them. And you get it. The stars become crucial here. A reminder that light exists. That the universe is bigger than this small pool of darkness you're swimming through. On clear nights, the stars are so bright they cast shadows. And the aurora borealis sometimes puts on shows that make you understand why ancient people thought the sky was alive. But when clouds cover everything, you're left in a darkness so complete it feels like you've been sealed in a box. The hallucinations start around week 7. Nothing dramatic, just small things at the edge of your vision. Movement that isn't there. Shadows that shift when they shouldn't. You mention this to Mikhail hesitantly, worried that you're losing your mind, but he nods as if you've just described a common cold. Brain tries to see things when there's nothing to see, he explains, making up images because it's bored. Normal. He's describing a phenomenon called visual release hallucinations, which can occur when sensory input is severely limited. Your brain, accustomed to processing constant visual information, starts generating its own images when starved of external stimuli. It's more common in people with vision loss, but extreme darkness can trigger similar effects. Usually, these hallucinations are benign geometric patterns, fleeting shapes, but they're unsettling nonetheless, a reminder that your brain is straining under conditions it wasn't designed for. You're beginning to understand that surviving the darkness isn't about toughness or willpower. It's about accepting that these 4 months exist in a different mode of being, with different rules and different costs. The Saka people survive it through community, routine, cultural practices that give structure to structureless time, and a deep, almost spiritual acceptance that winter is winter, darkness is darkness, and spring will eventually return because it always has. But you also understand why outsiders break. Why Russian workers brought in for the mines or infrastructure projects sometimes snap. Why some pack up and leave after a single winter. Why the regional mental health facilities see their highest admissions during the polar night. The darkness isn't just hard, it's existentially challenging in ways that defy easy description. As week 8 arrives and you're 2/3 through the deepest darkness, you find yourself clinging to small markers of progress. The days are getting incrementally longer, not noticeably, not in any way you can actually perceive, but the calendar says it's true, and you have to believe the calendar. By February, there will be 6 hours of daylight. By March 8, by April, the sun will return in full, and this whole nightmare will feel like something you imagined. Sarjalana, perhaps sensing your fragility, tells you a Saka story one evening. In the old times, she says, people believed that the sun went underground for winter to rest, to gather strength for the work of summer. Sun not abandoning us, she says. Sun sleeping, gathering light to give back later. We sleep too in our way. Wait together. It's a gentler cosmology than the brutal physics of axial tilt and orbital mechanics, and right now you need gentle. You need to believe that the darkness has a purpose, that it will end, that the sun is just resting and will return with interest. Outside, the darkness presses against the windows. 20 hours today, 19 and a half tomorrow. Slowly, incrementally, imperceptibly, the balance is shifting. You just have to survive long enough to see it. Your first real understanding of Saka architecture comes when you watch Mikhail and 3 neighbors spend an entire day repairing a crack in a foundation wall. Not because the crack is particularly large. It's maybe 3 centimeters wide. But because a 3-centimeter crack in a foundation at minus 70 degrees Celsius is the difference between a livable home and a tomb made of ice and splintered wood. Foundation is everything, Mikhail explains as he chips away frozen mud with a hand-forged chisel. If foundation fails, permafrost wins. House sinks, walls crack, heat escapes. Then you die. He says this cheerfully, as if describing a minor inconvenience rather than catastrophic structural failure leading to death by freezing. The house you're living in sits on stilts. Wooden posts sunk about 2 meters into the permafrost, raising the structure roughly a meter off the ground. This design looks precarious, like the house is tiptoeing across the landscape, but it's actually brilliant engineering developed over centuries of trial and error. The gap between the ground and the floor serves a critical purpose. It prevents the house's heat from melting the permafrost beneath it. Permafrost is permanently frozen ground, soil, rock, and sediment that's been frozen for at least 2 consecutive years, though in Yakutia, much of it has been frozen for tens of thousands of years. It forms a solid foundation when stable, but it's also ice-rich in many areas, meaning it contains massive amounts of frozen water. If you build directly on permafrost and heat your home above it, that heat conducts downward, melting the ice. The ground becomes unstable, saturated with water that has nowhere to drain because everything beneath is still frozen. Your house sinks, tilts, cracks, and eventually collapses. The stilts solve this by allowing cold air to circulate beneath the house, keeping the permafrost frozen even while the interior stays warm. It's a delicate thermal balance. You're essentially floating your home on frozen ground while maintaining a temperature difference of 80 to 90 degrees Celsius between the interior and the earth just beneath. Get it wrong and physics wins. Mikhail's house has walls that are roughly 30 centimeters thick, about a foot of insulation between you and instant death. The construction is layered. An inner wall of rough-hewn planks, then a space filled with dried moss, sawdust, and reindeer hair, which has superior insulating properties thanks to its hollow structure. Then an outer wall of thicker planks, and finally an exterior layer of wooden boards painted in that faded blue you see throughout the village. The roof is even thicker, maybe 40 centimeters, because heat rises and escaping warmth through the roof is pure waste. The windows are small, maybe 40 by 60 centimeters, and triple-paned with dead air spaces between each pane. Dead air is one of the best insulators available, which is why modern buildings use it too, though they usually don't face temperature differentials quite this extreme. Even with triple panes, frost still forms on the interior surface, creating those beautiful feathery patterns that look magical until you realize they represent heat escaping your living space. In old times, before glass was common, people used scraped reindeer bladders stretched over frames. Sargelana tells you one morning as she scrapes frost from the inside of the window with a wooden spatula. Let in some light, kept out some cold. Not as good as glass, but better than nothing. She's matter-of-fact about this recent transition. Glass only became widely available here in the mid-20th century, within living memory of the oldest residents. The door system is triple-layered too. The outer door opens into that airlock vestibule, then the vestibule has an inner door to the main living space. Some older homes have an additional layer, a thick felt or fur curtain hanging just inside the final door, creating one more barrier against the cold. You learn to use this system religiously. Outer door opens, you step in, outer door closes completely, only then do you open the inner door. Violate this protocol and you'll fill the house with air so cold it literally falls to the floor, creating a layer of Arctic air that takes hours to warm up again. The stove is the heart of the home, architecturally and functionally. Mikhail's stove is a massive brick construction that probably weighs close to a ton, built from fire bricks scavenged from an old Soviet industrial site and mortared together with clay mixed with horse dung, which apparently makes excellent heat-resistant mortar, though the smell during construction must have been challenging. The stove sits in the corner, radiating heat in all directions, with a complex series of internal baffles that force smoke to travel a circuitous route before exiting, extracting maximum heat from the fuel. Burn would constantly, October to April, Mikhail explains, opening the firebox to show you the roaring flames inside. Maybe 15-20 kilograms per day. More when colder. He does quick math. That's roughly 3,000 kilograms of wood per winter, or about 3 tons. Which means that summer isn't just about growing food and enjoying warmth. It's about cutting, splitting, and stacking enough wood to survive the next winter. You see the results stacked outside every house. Enormous wood piles, some 3 or 4 meters high, covered with tarps and plastic to shed snow. The ceiling is low, maybe 2.2 meters at its highest point, because heating a smaller volume is more efficient. Hot air rises, so keeping the ceiling low traps that heat closer to where people actually live. The single main room contains everything. Sleeping areas curtained off with heavy fabric, the cooking area around the stove, a small table for eating and working, storage trunks, and various tools and equipment hanging from wall pegs. Privacy is a luxury that the architecture simply can't afford. Heat efficiency trumps personal space. You notice there's no bathroom inside. Instead, there's an outhouse about 10 meters from the main structure. A small wooden shed perched on its own stilts, with a wooden seat over a deep pit that's frozen solid for most of the year. Using it is an experience that demands speed and focus. You step out into minus 70 degrees Celsius air, shuffle quickly to the outhouse, do your business as fast as humanly possible while trying not to freeze any sensitive anatomy, and scramble back to warmth. People have gotten frostbite in more embarrassing places than they care to admit. Why not build bathroom inside? You ask, shivering after one particularly urgent midnight trip. Mikhail shakes his head. Plumbing freezes. Water pipes, sewage pipes, all freeze solid unless heated. Heating pipes costs fuel, risks fire, and when pipes freeze anyway, they burst. Better to use old way. Some newer homes in Yakutsk, the regional capital, have indoor plumbing with elaborate heating systems, but here in Oymyakon, the engineering challenge outweighs the convenience. You poop outside. It's non-negotiable. Water is another architectural challenge. There are no water lines to individual homes, because keeping water flowing at -70 degrees Celsius is nearly impossible without constant energy input. Instead, families haul water from a central pump that's fed by a deep well, with the pump house heated to keep the mechanism operational. Mikhail makes this trip daily, carrying 2 large plastic jerry cans that together hold about 40 liters. This is all the water the family uses in a day, for cooking, drinking, washing dishes, and minimal personal hygiene. Baths are a weekly luxury at best, taken in a large metal tub placed near the stove, with water heated in pots. The village itself has a peculiar spatial logic driven entirely by thermal efficiency. Houses cluster together, not out of sociability, but to create windbreaks for each other and to minimize travel distances during the worst weather. The school, the small general store, the administrative building, everything is within a few hundred meters. Nobody spreads out if they can help it, because every additional meter of travel in -70 degrees Celsius is exposure, risk, and potentially danger. You notice that many structures are oriented with their smallest wall facing the prevailing winter wind, presenting a minimal profile to the cold. This isn't always possible. Sometimes terrain or permafrost stability dictates placement. But where possible, the buildings hunker down, presenting their shoulders to the cold rather than their full frontal area. It's architecture as defense, every design choice a small tactical victory in an ongoing war with the environment. The construction materials themselves are adapted to the cold. Wood dominates, because it handles freeze-thaw cycles better than most materials, has natural insulating properties, and is, relatively, abundant in the surrounding taiga forest. Metal is used sparingly and never for structural elements that will be exposed to the full cold. Steel becomes brittle at these temperatures, and aluminum conducts heat so efficiently it's basically useless for anything except tools used briefly and then brought back inside. Nails are a weak point. Traditional iron nails can become brittle and snap in extreme cold, so critical structural joints use wooden pegs or modern metal fasteners made from special cold-resistant alloys. Mikhail shows you a wall section where an old iron nail snapped, leaving a crack that had to be plugged with oakum and tar. Soviet nails, he says dismissively. Made for Moscow, not Yakutia. Historians still argue whether the Saka people originally lived in structures like these, or whether the current architectural style represents an adaptation influenced by Russian building techniques that arrived in the 17th and 18th centuries. Archaeological evidence suggests earlier Saka dwellings might have been semi-subterranean, partially dug into the earth to take advantage of ground insulation, which would have been warmer but also damper and more prone to carbon monoxide buildup from fires. The above-ground, stilt-based design seems to be a hybrid, indigenous understanding of local conditions combined with Russian log-building expertise, creating something uniquely suited to this environment. What strikes you most is the complete absence of anything purely decorative. Every element serves a function. The painted exterior isn't for beauty. The paint protects the wood from weathering and helps identify homes in blizzard conditions when visibility drops to 0. The small windows aren't an aesthetic choice, they're a thermal necessity. The low ceilings, the thick walls, the airlock entries, the outdoor toilet, every single design decision is made in service of survival, not comfort or appearance. And yet, there is beauty here, though it's the beauty of function perfected over generations. The way the house sits balanced on its stilts, solid despite its apparent precariousness. The elegant simplicity of the stove design, 1,000 years of ceramic and brick technology distilled into a lump that does one thing: radiate heat exceptionally well. The careful stacking of the woodpile, each log placed to shed water and allow air circulation, creating a structure that's almost sculptural in its precision. One afternoon, Mikhail takes you to visit Pyotr, an elderly man who lives in what might be the oldest house in the village. Pyotr is somewhere in his 80s, with a face like weathered wood and hands that shake slightly as he pours tea. His house is smaller than Mikhail's, maybe 20 square meters total, and the walls are noticeably thicker, at least 40 centimeters of layered wood, moss, and insulation. Built this myself, 1963, Piotr says in Russian with Mikhail translating. Used techniques my grandfather taught me. Some of these logs are from trees cut before I was born, aged and seasoned for 20 years before use. Properly dried wood insulates better, lasts longer, doesn't warp when frozen. The logs are massive. Some are 40 or 50 centimeters in diameter, and they're fitted together with a precision that seems impossible given the tools available. The joints are notched so each log locks into the ones above and below it, creating a structure that actually gets tighter and more stable as the wood contracts in the cold. There's a quirky bit of traditional knowledge at work here. Wood contracts when it freezes, but if you cut and fit the joints correctly, that contraction pulls the structure together rather than opening gaps. Piotr's roof is particularly interesting. A steep pitch covered in split wooden shingles, then a layer of birch bark for waterproofing. Even though water is mostly frozen up here, spring thaw and occasional winter precipitation are concerns. Then another layer of shingles, and finally a thick coat of earth held in place by a frame. The earth layer, now frozen solid, adds thermal mass and additional insulation. In summer, grass and wildflowers actually grow on his roof, making the house look like it's sprouting from the landscape. Roof is heavy, Piotr acknowledges. Maybe 2 tons. But heavy is good. Keeps house stable in wind. Insulates from summer heat and winter cold. He grins, showing gaps where teeth used to be. And if everything else fails, I can eat the grass. You're not entirely sure he's joking. The engineering challenges of building in permafrost regions have attracted serious scientific study. Modern engineering approaches in places like Yakutsk involve elaborate foundation systems. Some buildings sit on adjustable hydraulic jacks that can compensate for ground movement. Others use thermosiphons, passive heat exchangers that transfer warmth from the ground to the air, keeping permafrost frozen. And some ultramodern structures use refrigeration systems to actively freeze the ground beneath them. But here in Oymyakon, the technology is simpler. Stilts, thick walls, small windows, and the accumulated wisdom of people who've been solving this problem for centuries. What you're beginning to understand is that the architecture isn't just about physics and engineering. It's a cultural artifact that encodes generations of survival knowledge. The thickness of the walls, the height of the stilts, the size of the windows, the design of the stove, every measurement represents experiments run over lifetimes, failures that killed people, and successes that were passed down and refined. You're not living in a house. You're living inside a textbook written in wood and mud and frozen moss, a manual for staying alive that people have been editing for hundreds of years. As you head back to Mikhail's house through the darkness, the aurora borealis starts to dance overhead, green and purple curtains rippling across the stars. The temperature has dropped even further, and your breath is freezing with that distinctive tinkling sound. But inside the houses all around you, warm light glows through small windows, smoke rises in vertical columns from chimneys, and families are gathered around their stoves, holding on to warmth against a cold that would kill them in minutes if those carefully engineered walls ever failed. Your house, your fortress, your survival capsule against the void. As long as the walls hold and the fire burns, you live. You think you understand cold until the morning you step outside and your first breath feels like swallowing broken glass. The air at minus 73 degrees Celsius isn't just cold. It's actively hostile to the basic act of breathing, the thing you've done unconsciously roughly 20,000 times a day for your entire life. Suddenly, each breath requires strategy, technique, and a level of attention that makes you acutely aware of your own fragility. Mikhail watches you gasp and choke that first time, your lungs seizing in rejection of air that seems more like a caustic vapor than oxygen. Breathe through nose, slow, he instructs. Let nose warm air before it hits lungs. Through mouth, you damage lung tissue. Can cause bleeding. He's not exaggerating. At these temperatures, inhaling deeply through your mouth can cause actual tissue damage. The frozen air hitting the warm, moist surfaces of your throat and lungs creates thermal shock that can rupture capillaries and damage the delicate alveoli where oxygen exchange happens. People have coughed up blood after breathing too aggressively in extreme cold. Their lungs literally wounded by the air they need to survive. So you learn to breathe like Mikhail. Small, controlled inhales through your nose, where the turbinate bones and mucous membranes have a chance to warm the air by a crucial few degrees before it reaches your lungs. You wrap a scarf across your face, Not just any scarf, but a thick wool one that creates a buffer zone, a pocket of air that your breath warms slightly before inhaling it again. You're essentially preheating your air supply with your own exhaust, a biological heat exchanger that's the difference between functional breathing and pulmonary damage. Within 30 seconds of being outside, the scarf has accumulated a thick layer of ice. Your breath condenses instantly in the cold, freezing onto the fabric and forming a crusty, crystalline coating that grows with each exhale. The ice buildup gets so heavy that you can feel the scarf's weight increasing, pulling at the back of your neck. Some days, people's scarves freeze so solid they have to be cut off rather than untied. Your nose presents its own challenges. The moisture in your nostrils freezes within seconds, creating an odd sensation. Not quite painful, but deeply uncomfortable, like having tiny shards of ice forming and breaking inside your nasal passages with each breath. Your nose hairs stiffen into frozen needles. If you touch your nose with a bare hand, even briefly, you risk frostbite to both the nose and the fingers. Mikhail's solution is a face mask made from reindeer hide with the fur facing inward, leaving only a small opening for the eyes. You look ridiculous, like some kind of Arctic bandit, but vanity is a luxury that minus 73 degrees Celsius doesn't permit. Your eyelashes become their own problem. The moisture from your eyes freezes on your lashes, first creating small beads of ice, then causing your lashes to stick together. You have to periodically wipe your eyes to prevent them from freezing shut entirely. Some people trim their eyelashes short during winter to minimize this issue, though that comes with its own problems. Eyelashes serve important protective functions, filtering dust and debris that, okay, fine, is less of an issue when everything is frozen, but still. The really insidious danger is the ice mask. As you breathe through your scarf or face covering, your exhaled moisture freezes in layers around your mouth and nose, building up into a thick crust of ice that can actually seal your airways. You have to periodically reach up with mittened hands and crack the ice away, breaking off chunks that sometimes include bits of frozen saliva, frozen mucus, and frozen condensation from your breath. It's disgusting and vital in equal measure. Never break ice near skin, Sargelana warns you after watching you carelessly knock a chunk of ice off your scarf, scraping your cheek in the process. Ice this cold is sharp like glass, can cut skin and cut freezes instantly. Small wound becomes big problem. She's right, you look down at the ice chunk in your hand and realize it has edges that could genuinely cut. Molecular structures frozen so solid they're essentially crystalline blades. Your lungs themselves are struggling with the oxygen concentration. Cold air is denser than warm air, which sounds like it should mean more oxygen. But the extreme cold also causes your bronchial tubes to constrict, narrowing the airways and making it harder to draw insufficient air. You find yourself breathing faster, more shallowly, which is exactly what you shouldn't do because rapid breathing brings more frozen air into contact with your tissues. It's a physiological catch-22 that requires conscious override of your body's automatic responses. People who work outside in these conditions, and yes, some work must continue even in extreme cold, have developed specific breathing techniques that seem almost meditative. They breathe in through the nose for a count of 4, hold for a count of 2, then exhale slowly through pursed lips through the scarf. This rhythm maximizes heat exchange, minimizes tissue damage, and prevents hyperventilation. It's breathing as a learned skill rather than an autonomic function, which feels deeply wrong on some primal level. The oxygen deprivation has cognitive effects too. Your brain, which consumes roughly 20% of your body's oxygen despite being only 2% of your body weight, starts running on fumes. You feel foggy, slow, like you're thinking through cotton. Simple math becomes difficult. You lose words mid-sentence. Decision-making feels laborious. Mikhail calls this cold stupid, and it's dangerous because impaired judgment in an environment this hostile can be fatal. One afternoon, you watch Adalina walk to the small shed where the family keeps their horses, a trip of maybe 50 meters. She's bundled in so many layers she looks spherical, and she's breathing through a thick wool scarf wrapped multiple times around her face. Even from a distance, you can see the cloud of frozen breath that surrounds her. A personal fog bank that moves with her, created by the instant condensation and freezing of her exhaled air. The locals call this phenomenon white silence when it's thick enough, because the crystals muffle sound. The moisture doesn't just freeze in the air around you, it falls. Your frozen breath becomes tiny ice crystals that drift downward, creating that tinkling sound Mikhail called the whisper of the stars. On extremely still, cold days, the ground around populated areas becomes covered in a fine layer of human breath ice, a frozen record of respiration. It's beautiful and haunting, evidence of life in a landscape that seems designed to extinguish it. Your body is working overtime to warm each breath, and that work generates a metabolic cost. You're burning calories just breathing, adding to the already enormous energy expenditure required to maintain core temperature. This is partly why people in extreme cold consume staggering amounts of food. Your basal metabolic rate increases significantly, and something like 10 to 15% of that increase is just the cost of conditioning the air you breathe. There's a quirky historical debate among scholars about whether pre-industrial peoples living in these regions had larger lung capacities or different respiratory adaptations than populations from temperate climates. Some skeletal evidence suggests barrel-chested builds that might indicate enhanced lung volume, but historians still argue whether this represents genetic adaptation, childhood development in response to environmental conditions, or just selection bias in which individuals survive to reproduce. The Saka people tend toward robust builds with relatively large lung capacities, but separating genetic inheritance from environmental adaptation is scientifically tricky. The extreme cold also affects your vocal cords and your ability to speak. Cold air dries out the mucous membranes that keep your vocal cords lubricated, making your voice raspy and rough. Talking requires you to repeatedly inhale cold air, which is damaging, so people speak less when outside, communicating in gestures and brief, essential phrases. Mikhail and his neighbors can have entire conversations with just hand signals and grunts, preserving both warmth and vocal cord function. You discover that even singing, something you'd think would be universal, becomes dangerous. Singing requires deep breaths and extended exhales, maximizing exposure to the cold air. There are traditional Saka songs, including throat singing techniques, but these are performed indoors, around the stove, where the air is warm and the lungs are safe. Outside, silence isn't just golden, it's survival. The act of eating outside is almost impossible. If you try to consume food in minus 70 degrees Celsius air, it freezes in your mouth before you can chew it properly. Liquids are out of the question. Water or tea would freeze solid between cup and lips. When people absolutely must eat while working outside, they keep food inside their clothing, warmed by body heat, and they eat quickly, mechanically, swallowing before the cold can penetrate too deeply into the mouth. It's fuel consumption, not dining. Your teeth become sensitive, aching when exposed to the cold air. Dental problems are a serious concern here. The rapid temperature changes from warm interior to frozen exterior and back can crack enamel or aggravate existing cavities. Some of the older residents have lost teeth not to decay but to thermal stress fractures, their enamel simply giving up under the repeated expansion and contraction cycles. The most terrifying moment comes when you're outside alone one evening. You've gotten overconfident, stepping out to check something without properly covering your face, and you inhale sharply through your mouth in surprise at something. You can't even remember what. The cold air hits your lungs like a punch, and you immediately start coughing violently, uncontrollably. Each cough brings in more cold air, which triggers more coughing. A vicious cycle that has you doubled over, unable to breathe properly, ice forming on your lips from the moisture in your cough. Mikhail appears from nowhere, grabbing you and pushing you back toward the door. Inside. Now. He shoves you through the airlock and into the main room, where the warm air feels like a physical presence. You keep coughing for another 2 minutes, your lungs spasming, and when you finally catch your breath, you notice flecks of blood in the ice that's formed on the scarf you were clutching. You've damaged something inside, nothing catastrophic, but enough to be scary. This is how people die, Mikhail says, his voice hard. Not from cold outside, but from cold inside. Damaged lungs get infected. Infection in winter, far from hospital, often fatal. He's not trying to scare you. He's stating facts. Pneumonia is a significant cause of death in these regions, and it often starts with exactly this kind of respiratory trauma. That night, Sargelana makes you drink a foul-tasting tea made from pine needles and some kind of root you don't recognize. For lungs, she says, old medicine helps repair damage, prevents infection. You have no idea if there's any medical validity to it, but you drink it anyway, desperate for anything that might help. The tea is hot enough to hurt going down, but the heat feels good, like you're cauterizing the damage from the inside. You sleep poorly, hyper-aware of each breath, monitoring for any signs of deterioration. But morning comes, and your breathing is mostly normal, just a slight wheeze that fades over the next few days. You got lucky. The realization of how easily that could have gone differently. How one moment of carelessness could have led to a spiral of infection and potentially death in a place where medical care is minimal, settles into your bones alongside the cold. From that day forward, you treat breathing outside the way Mikhail does, as a technical skill requiring constant attention. Nose breathing, scarf positioning, regular ice removal, controlled pace, never running, never gasping, never taking for granted the act that keeps you alive. The air here isn't just cold, it's weaponized, and every breath is a small negotiation with an environment that would prefer you stop breathing altogether. You begin to understand why the Saka people have such elaborate greetings and farewells when someone leaves or returns from being outside. It's not just politeness, it's acknowledgement that they've survived another exposure, that they've come back from a place where breathing itself is dangerous, and that their return is worth marking. Because in Oymyakon, at minus 73 degrees Celsius, every breath you take is a small miracle, and every breath you'll take tomorrow is anything but guaranteed. You thought you understood hunger until you experienced hunger at minus 70 degrees Celsius. Your body isn't just requesting food, it's screaming for it, demanding fuel with an urgency that borders on panic. You're consuming somewhere between 4,000 and 5,000 calories per day, nearly double your normal intake, and you're still losing weight. Your metabolism has shifted into overdrive, burning everything you eat just to maintain the 37 degrees Celsius core temperature that keeps you alive. Breakfast is a shock to your system, both literally and culturally. Sarjalana places a bowl in front of you containing what looks like frozen fish, sliced paper thin, still rock solid. This is stroganina, raw frozen fish eaten while still frozen, and it's a staple food here. You're supposed to dip each translucent slice into a mixture of salt and pepper, then let it partially thaw in your mouth before chewing. The texture is bizarre, crunchy at first, then slightly chewy as it warms, with a clean, almost sweet flavor that's nothing like cooked fish. Nurka, Mikhail says, pointing to the fish. Sockeye salmon, caught last summer, frozen immediately, stays good all winter. He's eating his with obvious enjoyment, going through the bowl faster than seems physically possible. You notice his portion is roughly twice the size of yours, and he'll likely eat another bowl after this one. The caloric math is simple. An adult male doing physical labor in extreme cold can burn 6,000 calories per day or more. Food isn't pleasure, it's fuel. The preparation and storage of food here operates on principles completely different from anywhere with a functioning freezer economy. In Oymyakon, the entire outdoor environment is a freezer that never turns off. People keep their long-term food supplies in unheated sheds or even just stacked outside, covered with tarps. Meat, fish, berries, vegetables, everything freezes solid within minutes of being placed outside and stays frozen until you bring it in to thaw and cook. Mikhail takes you to his outdoor storage shed, and opening the door feels like entering a museum of frozen time. Whole fish are stacked like cordwood, frozen so solid you could use them as clubs. There are chunks of horse meat, dark red and marbled with fat, each piece the size of your thigh. Reindeer haunches hang from hooks, their surfaces covered in a fine layer of frost. There are bags of berries, cranberries, blueberries, cloudberries, picked during the brief summer and frozen in their natural state. Everything is preserved perfectly, essentially freeze-dried by the environment itself, requiring no electricity, no refrigeration technology, just geography and temperature. This is maybe 400 kilograms of food, Mikhail estimates, gesturing at the shed's contents. Enough for family through winter if we're careful. If winter is long or hunting is bad, maybe not enough. Then we get hungry. He says this matter-of-factly, but you understand the implication. Food security here isn't guaranteed. A bad fishing season, a harsh winter that lasts longer than expected, an injury that prevents hunting. Any of these can mean the difference between adequacy and starvation. The diet is overwhelmingly based on animal products. Fish and meat make up roughly 70 to 80% of caloric intake, with the remainder coming from stored vegetables, berries, and the small amount of grain and imported food that makes it to the village store. This isn't a choice driven by preference. It's dictated by what can be produced or procured in this environment. Vegetables don't grow here for 8 months of the year, and importing fresh produce is prohibitively expensive and logistically challenging. So you eat what the land provides. Fish from the rivers, meat from the horses and reindeer, and whatever you manage to gather during summer. The high-fat, high-protein diet is actually ideal for extreme cold. Fat contains 9 calories per gram, more than twice the energy density of carbohydrates or protein, and your body burns it efficiently to maintain temperature. Mikhail's breakfast includes not just the stroganina but also a chunk of horse fat, pure white adipose tissue that he eats like cheese, cutting thin slices and consuming them with bread and tea. The fat content would horrify a cardiologist in a temperate climate, but here it's survival food. Your body needs that fat to survive. You watch Sargelana prepare lunch, which involves a whole frozen fish being brought inside to partially thaw. She doesn't thaw it completely, that would take hours and isn't necessary. Instead, she places it near the stove for about 30 minutes, just enough to soften the exterior while the core remains frozen. Then she hacks it apart with a cleaver, the fish breaking into chunks rather than being filleted. These chunks go into a massive pot with water, onions, from the summer garden, frozen and stored, and salt. The result is a fish soup called uka that's dense with chunks of fish, bones included, and rich with fat that floats on the surface in golden pools. You're expected to eat the entire fish, bones and all. The bones have softened during cooking and are edible, providing calcium and other minerals. Nothing is wasted. The fish heads, which you'd normally discard, are considered choice pieces. The cheeks and eyes are particularly prized for their fat content. Mikhail sucks the eyes out of the skull and eats them with evident satisfaction, then offers you a head. Best part, he says. Most fat, most vitamins. You try it, trying not to think too hard about what you're doing. The texture is challenging, gelatinous and fatty, but the flavor is intense and rich. Your body, desperate for calories, actually responds positively. You feel warmth spreading through you as the fat hits your system, your metabolism kicking into gear. It's not delicious in any conventional sense, but it's satisfying on a deeper, more primitive level. The hunting and fishing that supply this food continue even in the extreme cold, though with significant adaptations. Fishing happens through ice that can be 2 meters thick. Men drill holes with hand augers, a process that can take an hour of hard labor, then drop lines baited with frozen minnows or small pieces of meat. The fish that live in these rivers have their own antifreeze proteins in their blood, allowing them to survive in water that's barely above freezing. When pulled from the water, they freeze solid within seconds, going from living creature to frozen food without any intermediate state. Mikhail takes you ice fishing one relatively warm day, only -62 degrees Celsius, practically balmy by local standards. The process is brutal. You drill the hole, breathing heavily through your scarf, your arms burning from the effort. Then you sit on a small stool, hunched over the hole, dropping your line into the black water below. The fish aren't actively feeding in winter, so you might sit for hours before getting a bite. The cold seeps through every layer of clothing, through the stool into your bones. Your feet go numb despite the felt boots and multiple socks. Your hands, even in thick mittens, ache from the cold. Sometimes fall in, Mikhail mentions casually, gesturing at the ice hole. If you fall in winter water, have maybe 2 minutes before body stops working. Must get out immediately, get to fire, or you die. He's not trying to scare you. He's stating the reality. Immersion in near-freezing water causes cold shock response. Your body gasps involuntarily, often inhaling water, then your muscles seize up, making coordinated movement nearly impossible. Even strong swimmers drown within minutes. And if you somehow manage to get out, you're now soaking wet in -62 degrees Celsius air, which means you're going to freeze solid unless you can get warm within minutes. After 3 hours, you catch one fish, a broad whitefish maybe 40 centimeters long. Mikhail has caught 4. The fish freeze before you can even put them in your bag. Mikhail is pleased. This is a successful outing. You've burned perhaps 2,000 calories sitting in the cold, and you've acquired maybe 1,500 calories worth of fish. The math barely works, but it's necessary. Store-bought food is expensive and limited. The fish you catch yourself is free, aside from the cost measured in frozen toes and aching joints. Horse meat is the other major protein source, and the horses themselves are remarkable. Yakutian horses are small, stocky, and covered in winter coats so thick they look like they're wearing fursuits. They survive outside year-round, pawing through snow to reach the dried grass beneath. Their metabolism adapted to extract nutrients from food that seems barely edible. In spring, several horses are slaughtered, providing meat that's distributed among families and frozen for winter use. Every part of the horse is used: meat, organs, hide, even the intestines, which are cleaned and used as sausage casings. Sargelana shows you how to prepare horse meat sausage, a process that involves mincing frozen meat with fat, adding salt and garlic, stuffing the mixture into intestines, and then hanging the sausages outside to freeze and age. The aging process, slow and cold, develops complex flavors and makes the meat slightly more tender. By March, the sausages have been hanging for months, developing a concentrated, intense flavor that's actually quite good when fried with onions. The summer vegetables that were grown and frozen provide essential nutrients, but they're rationed carefully. A bag of frozen potatoes needs to last months, so portions are small. Carrots, onions, cabbage. These appear in soups and stews, but never as main dishes. Fresh vegetables don't exist from October to May. You're getting your vitamin C from pine needle tea, rose hip preserves, and the occasional imported jar of pickles. Scurvy is a real concern, one that Soviet doctors took seriously enough to establish vitamin supplementation programs in remote Yakutian villages. There's a quirky cottage industry in frozen milk. Some families keep a few cows, which produce milk even in winter, though the yield drops significantly in the cold. The milk is immediately frozen in small blocks or cylinders, creating frozen milk popsicles that are stored outside and brought in to thaw as needed. The freezing changes the texture slightly. It becomes slightly grainy when thawed, but it's a source of calcium and fat that's otherwise hard to obtain. Occasionally, the village store receives a shipment of goods from Yakutsk, a journey that can take several days by truck over the Road of Bones. The truck arrives with frozen bread, frozen vegetables, canned goods, tea, sugar, and sometimes luxury items like chocolate or cookies. The entire village turns out for these deliveries, which happen irregularly depending on weather and road conditions. Prices are astronomical. A loaf of bread might cost 3 or 4 times what it costs in Yakutsk, and fresh fruit, when it appears at all, is so expensive it's essentially jewelry. You witness one of these deliveries and watch people's faces as they sort through the available goods, calculating what they can afford, what they need, what they can do without. A woman buys a single orange for her children, an orange that costs the equivalent of what Mikhail earns in a day of labor. She'll cut it into tiny pieces so each child gets a taste. A momentary burst of vitamin C and exotic flavor in the midst of winter's monotony. The most disturbing food item you encounter is permafrost meat, the flesh of ancient animals preserved in the frozen ground. Mikhail casually mentions that, during particularly hard times, people have dug up mammoth remains and eaten the meat, which can be tens of thousands of years old but perfectly preserved. Tastes bad, he admits. Very strong, like rotten, but can keep you alive if nothing else available. Historians still argue whether this practice was widespread or apocryphal, but there are documented cases from the early 20th century of people consuming mammoth meat during famines. Your relationship with food transforms completely. Back home, eating was often mindless, recreational even, snacking out of boredom, dining for pleasure, trying new flavors for entertainment. Here, eating is a serious business, a necessary task performed multiple times per day to prevent your body from consuming itself. You eat when you're not hungry because you know you'll need the calories later. You eat fat not because it tastes good but because fat equals warmth equals survival. You also begin to understand the social dimensions of food sharing. When Mikhail catches extra fish, he doesn't sell them. He distributes them to neighbors who were less successful. When Pyotr's family receives a bag of potatoes in a care package from relatives in Yakutsk, Those potatoes appear in soups across multiple households. There's no formal accounting, no expectation of exact reciprocity, just an understanding that survival is collective. In an environment this harsh, individualism is a luxury no one can afford. Food sharing isn't generosity. It's the social insurance policy that might keep you alive when your own luck runs out. By your 8th week, you've adapted to the diet, at least physically. Your body has become remarkably efficient at processing fat and protein. Your digestive system, which initially protested the high-fat diet with some uncomfortable consequences, has adjusted. You've stopped craving carbohydrates quite so desperately. You've even developed a taste for stroganina, appreciating its clean flavor and the way it delivers nutrients without requiring cooking fuel. But the hunger never quite goes away. You finish a meal feeling full, and within 2 hours you're hungry again, your metabolism burning through the calories like a furnace consuming wood. You understand now why traditional Saka clothing includes large pockets and pouches. People carry food constantly, snacking throughout the day to keep their internal fires burning. A few pieces of dried fish, a chunk of fat, some frozen berries, these are the fuel that keeps the machine running. And the machine must keep running because the alternative is simple and final. Stop eating enough and your body starts burning muscle to maintain temperature. Continue that and your core temperature begins to drop. Drop below about 35 degrees Celsius, and hypothermia begins its inexorable work, shutting down systems one by one until nothing remains but frozen flesh. Food isn't life's pleasure here. It's life itself, measured in calories and fat grams and the precious heat they generate when consumed and burned. And you eat mechanically and necessarily 3 times a day and more, feeding the furnace, staying alive. You're beginning to realize that the Saka people aren't just surviving Oymykon's winter. They've actually developed a sophisticated cultural technology for thriving in conditions that should be uninhabitable. Every aspect of their traditional knowledge, from clothing to spirituality to social organization, represents generations of accumulated wisdom about living at the edge of human endurance. Mikhail's grandmother, Oksana, is the keeper of this knowledge. She's 93 years old, tiny and withered like a dried mushroom, but her mind is sharp and her memory reaches back to a time before electricity, before Soviet collectivization, before the modern world intruded on this frozen corner of existence. She speaks almost no Russian, communicating in Saka, with Mikhail translating her words into a mixture of Russian and broken English for your benefit. The old people knew things we're forgetting, Mikhail says as Oksana settles onto a bench near the stove, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. How to read weather, how to find food when there's no food, how to keep warm with nothing. She remembers the old ways. Oksana's first lesson is about reading the cold itself. To your untrained senses, minus 65 degrees Celsius and minus 72 degrees Celsius feel equally terrible, just varying shades of too cold to survive. But Oksana can distinguish temperature variations with remarkable precision just by stepping outside for a few seconds. The way air feels on skin, the sound of footsteps on snow, how breath freezes, all different at different temperatures. Mikhail translates. She says at minus 60 degrees Celsius, snow squeaks like mouse. At minus 70 degrees Celsius, squeaks like metal scraping metal. Below minus 75 degrees Celsius, snow doesn't squeak at all. Too cold, crystals won't compress properly. You test this the next time you go outside, listening to your footsteps. She's right. The sound changes. At minus 68 degrees Celsius today, each step produces a high-pitched shriek. The snow crystals compressed by your weight creating friction that generates the sound. It's information encoded in sound, a thermometer you can hear if you know how to listen. Oksana also teaches you to read the aurora. Some people think aurora is just lights, pretty to look at, Mikhail translates. But lights tell you about weather coming, about cold getting worse or better. According to traditional Saka knowledge, certain patterns and colors in the aurora predict temperature changes, approaching storms, and even the likelihood of good hunting. Modern science has partially validated this. The aurora is caused by solar wind interacting with Earth's magnetic field, and increased solar activity does correlate with certain atmospheric conditions. But the specific predictive knowledge Oksana possesses goes far beyond what meteorology has documented. She points to the window, where a faint green aurora is visible in the darkness. This aurora moves slowly, stays low on horizon, means cold will continue, maybe get worse. When aurora dances high, moves fast, has red colors, that means change coming, maybe warmer, maybe storm. You have no way to verify this, but Mikhail nods. She's never wrong about weather. Scientists come with instruments, she just looks at sky. She knows first. The traditional clothing knowledge is even more sophisticated than you initially understood. Oksana shows you a coat she made herself decades ago. A masterpiece of engineering disguised as primitive handicraft. The outer layer is reindeer hide with the fur removed, treated with a mixture of fish oil, animal brains, and wood ash to make it completely windproof while remaining flexible. Beneath that is a layer of reindeer fur with the hair facing inward, providing insulation. But the genius is in the construction. The coat is designed with deliberate air gaps between layers, creating pockets of trapped air that serve as additional insulation. Modern coats use foam or synthetic fill. Mikhail explains as you examine the garment. This coat uses air and fur. Fur is better because it breathes, lets moisture escape so you don't get wet from sweating. If you get wet inside your coat, you freeze. Fur prevents this. The coat also has a hood lined with wolf fur, which has the unique property of not accumulating ice from breath condensation. Science people studied this, Mikhail adds. Wolf fur has special structure that prevents ice buildup. Inuit people discovered this hundreds of years ago, used it for parka hoods. Oksana's boots are equally impressive. They're made from reindeer leg skin with the fur inside, and they rise to just below the knee. But between the inner fur layer and the outer hide, she's stuffed dried sedge grass, which compresses slightly with each step, creating an insulating layer that also wicks away moisture. Must change grass every few days, Mikhail translates. Old grass gets compressed, wet, stops working. Fresh grass keeps feet warm and dry. You've been wearing modern insulated boots, and your feet are constantly cold. Oksana's boots, made from materials available in the environment, are superior. The Saka people's traditional knowledge extends to medicine, though separating effective treatments from folk belief is complicated. Oksana prepares various remedies that the family uses regularly. Pine needle tea for vitamin C and respiratory health, a salve made from bear fat and birch bark for treating frostbite damage, and a bitter tincture made from willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, for pain and inflammation. Some of these remedies have genuine pharmacological basis. Others might be pure placebo. But in an environment where modern medical care is days away at best, any treatment that provides comfort or healing is valuable. More intriguingly, Oksana practices a form of frost prediction that seems almost supernatural. She'll announce that tomorrow will be especially cold, or that the temperature will rise slightly, or that a particular day is good for traveling versus one that isn't. Her predictions are based on a complex web of observations. The behavior of the horses, the appearance of the stars, the feel of the air, the patterns in the frost that forms on windows, even her own joint pain. Old bones know cold better than thermometer, Mikhail says with a grin, though Oksana's predictions are accurate enough that people plan their activities around them. The spiritual dimension of Saka traditional knowledge is harder for you to grasp, but it's deeply integrated with survival practices. Oksana practices a form of shamanic belief that predates both Christianity and Buddhism, though it's been influenced by both over the centuries. She makes offerings to the spirit of cold, small gifts of food or tobacco left outside, accompanied by whispered words you don't understand. She's asking cold to be merciful, to not kill anyone this winter, Mikhail explains. Some people say this is just superstition, but I think it's psychology. Making offering makes you respect the cold, reminds you it can kill you, keeps you careful. There's also a tradition of reading animal behavior as a survival tool. Oksana points out that the horses have begun standing closer together and facing the same direction, away from the north. Means very cold wind coming from north in 2, maybe 3 days. Horses know before we know. Again, there's probably a scientific explanation. Horses can detect barometric pressure changes and respond to subtle environmental cues humans miss. But the practical knowledge is what matters. If the horses are warning of a cold wind, you prepare accordingly. The Saka people's social organization is itself a survival technology. Traditional Saka society was organized around extended family groups called imag, with multiple generations living in close proximity and sharing resources. This wasn't sentimentality, it was practical. More people meant more labor for essential tasks, more knowledge dispersed across age groups, and built-in redundancy if someone became injured or ill. The Soviet collectivization disrupted these traditional structures, but elements persist. You notice that Mikhail's household isn't just his immediate family. There are cousins, distant relatives, and even unrelated neighbors who drift through, sharing meals and labor. No one survives winter alone. Mikhail says one evening as you're all gathered around the stove. Need help cutting wood. Need help if you get sick. Need someone to check on you if you don't come back from hunting. City people think independence is good, but here independence means death. We survive together or we die together. This communal survival extends to knowledge transmission. Oksana spends hours teaching Adalina traditional skills, how to sofer, how to prepare food, how to read the signs of cold and weather. Adalina, with the impatience of a modern child who has access to the internet when it works and YouTube videos, sometimes seems less than enthralled. But Oksana persists, and Mikhail enforces attention. If she doesn't learn these things, he says quietly, and someday computers don't work, internet goes down, she won't survive. This knowledge kept our people alive for thousands of years. Can't let it disappear in one generation. Historians still argue whether the Saka people are indigenous to this region or migrants who adapted to it. Linguistic evidence suggests they migrated from further south, possibly from the area around Lake Baikal, sometime in the medieval period. But what's clear is that, whenever they arrived, they developed a suite of adaptations, cultural, technological, and possibly even genetic, that allowed them to survive in one of Earth's harshest environments. The genetic component is fascinating and controversial. Some studies suggest that Saka people have higher than average brown fat deposits. Brown fat generates heat more efficiently than white fat, more efficient circulation to extremities, and possibly different thyroid hormone regulation that helps maintain body temperature. But separating genetic adaptation from childhood acclimatization is scientifically challenging, and making claims about genetic differences in populations is fraught with historical baggage. What's undeniable is that people who grow up here seem to handle the cold better than outsiders, whether that's nature, nurture, or both. Oksana has one teaching that particularly strikes you. Through Mikhail, she explains, the cold is not your enemy. The cold is just the cold. It doesn't hate you, doesn't want to kill you. It's like water, you can drown in water, but water isn't evil. Respect it, understand it, work with it, and you can survive. Fear it or fight it, and you will lose. This reframing of the environment, not as hostile but as neutral, as something to be understood rather than conquered, represents a profound philosophical adaptation that might be as important as the clothing or the food strategies. She also teaches you a traditional practice called warming the spirit. When you're feeling most defeated by the darkness and cold, when your mood is at its lowest, she instructs you to sit by the stove, close your eyes, and remember summer in vivid detail. The feel of sun on your skin, the smell of grass and wildflowers, the sound of birdsong. Body can be cold, but spirit can stay warm if you remember warmth. Mikhail translates, keep summer alive inside you, and winter cannot kill your soul. It sounds like mystical nonsense, but when you try it, sitting with your eyes closed, deliberately conjuring memories of warmth and light, you find it genuinely helps. Modern psychology would call this a form of guided visualization or positive imagery, a technique used to manage stress and depression. Oksana's tradition developed its centuries before psychology existed as a discipline. The quirky detail that most fascinates you is Oksana's ice storage system. She has a small pit dug into the permafrost behind the house, maybe 2 meters deep, where she keeps a particular type of ice she harvested last spring from a specific lake. This ice stays frozen even in summer, Mikhail explains, because permafrost keeps it cold. But she says ice from this lake is special, purer, clearer, melts slower. She uses it for medicine for special occasions. Regular ice from river isn't as good. You have no idea if there's any real difference between ice sources, But the care with which she selects and stores this ice suggests layers of traditional knowledge you can't fully access. One night, Oksana tells stories, traditional Saka tales about the creation of the world, about heroic figures who battled cold and darkness, about the origins of the Saka people. The stories aren't just entertainment, they're encoded survival wisdom. One tale describes a hero who survived by digging into a snowbank and breathing through a tube, creating an emergency shelter, which is an actual survival technique. Another story emphasizes the importance of never traveling alone in winter, disguised as a cautionary tale about a lonely hunter who disappeared. The stories transmit practical knowledge wrapped in narrative, making them memorable and emotionally resonant. As you listen to Oksana's quavering voice in the lamplight, with the stove crackling and the darkness pressing against the windows, you understand that you're receiving something precious and increasingly rare. Direct transmission of knowledge from someone who learned it from people who learned it from people stretching back generations, an unbroken chain of wisdom about surviving the unsurvivable. This cold isn't the hardest thing our people have survived, Mikhail says, translating Oksana's final words for the evening. We survived Mongol invasions, Russian conquest, Soviet purges, famines, wars. Cold is just cold. But we're still here. We'll still be here long after you leave, long after we're gone. The cold doesn't win. We do. And as you drift towards sleep, warm and fed and surrounded by people who have turned survival into an art form, you believe her. The morning your phone dies permanently, you experience a small existential crisis that Mikhail finds deeply amusing. The device has been failing slowly over weeks. Battery draining in minutes despite a full charge, screen flickering, apps freezing. But you've been in denial, treating it like a lifeline to the modern world. Now, at minus 74 degrees Celsius, the lithium-ion battery has finally given up entirely, the chemical reactions that store electrical energy simply unable to function at this temperature. The phone is now a sleek, expensive paperweight. Welcome to real Oymyakon, Mikhail says, watching you stare mournfully at the dead screen. Here, technology doesn't save you. Technology breaks. Only knowledge saves you. He's not wrong. The extreme cold wages war on every piece of modern technology, exploiting weaknesses in materials and design that simply don't matter in temperate climates. Your phone is just the first casualty in what becomes a catalog of technological failures that would be comedic if they weren't so alarming. The village's vehicles represent an ongoing battle between human ingenuity and thermodynamic reality. Remember that nobody turns off their engines from October to April? That's not an exaggeration or a quirky local custom. It's absolute necessity. Mikhail's truck, a battered U-452 that looks like a Soviet-era loaf of bread with wheels, has been running continuously since mid-October. The engine idles 24 hours a day, consuming fuel at a rate that makes you wince, but the alternative is worse. If engine stops, oil turns to paste, battery dies in minutes, fuel gels, and engine block can crack from cold. Mikhail explains, patting the truck's hood with genuine affection. Restarting frozen engine is almost impossible. Some people try damage engine permanently. Better to waste fuel than break truck. No truck means no way to get to Yakutsk if emergency happens. The truck itself has been modified extensively for Arctic operation. The radiator has a cover that can be adjusted to control airflow. In extreme cold, you actually need to prevent the engine from cooling too much, which seems backward until you understand that the ideal operating temperature for an internal combustion engine is around 90 degrees Celsius, and maintaining that in minus 74 degrees Celsius ambient temperature requires carefully managing heat loss. The fuel system has multiple filters and a heating element to prevent diesel from gelling. The battery is oversized and wrapped in insulation. The tires are a special winter compound that remains flexible in extreme cold. Though flexible is relative, they're still rock hard compared to summer tires. You watch one of Mikhail's neighbors attempt to move his car after it had been turned off for several hours. A mistake born of forgetting and immediately regretted. The man climbs into the driver's seat, turns the key, and gets only a weak grinding sound. The battery, already compromised by the cold, doesn't have enough power to turn over the engine through the now paste-like oil. He tries again. The grinding becomes weaker. Third attempt produces only a click. The battery is dead. The solution involves jumper cables, 3 other running vehicles connected in series to provide enough amperage, and a portable heater aimed at the engine block for nearly an hour to warm the oil enough to flow. The process consumes the labor of 4 men and probably 5 liters of fuel. When the engine finally catches and roars to life, there's a genuine cheer. The man whose car it is looks sheepish but grateful. He'll leave it running now until spring. Your laptop lasted longer than your phone, but it too eventually succumbed. The screen developed dead pixels in spreading patterns, the hard drive began making ominous clicking sounds, and finally the entire system refused to boot. The cold contracts materials and components designed with tolerances measured in micrometers can't handle the thermal stress. The laptop is in your bag, useless, a reminder of how fragile our digital tools actually are. The village's electrical infrastructure is its own saga of ongoing crisis management. Power comes from a diesel generator facility about a kilometer outside the village, and the generators require constant attention to keep running. You visit the facility with Mikhail one afternoon and find 2 men working in an unheated building. Heating it would be pointless. The doors are constantly opening, wearing layer upon layer of clothing, maintaining machines that protest the cold with every revolution. Generators run on diesel, but diesel freezes at about minus 30 degrees Celsius. One of the men explains through Mikhail's translation. So we use special Arctic diesel, mixed with additives, stored in heated tanks. Even then, fuel lines freeze sometimes. We have to check every few hours. Keep everything moving. The facility has redundant systems, multiple generators, backup fuel pumps, emergency heating elements, because if power fails in winter, people die. The electrical lines themselves are problematic. Metal contracts in the cold, and power lines can snap under the thermal stress, especially if combined with ice buildup or wind. The village experiences power outages regularly, sometimes lasting hours or even days. Every household has backup heating, usually the wood stove that predates electrification, because you cannot rely on electricity to stay alive. Your LED headlamp, which you smugly thought was immune to battery problems because it used regular alkaline batteries, has become nearly useless. The batteries haven't died completely, but their capacity has dropped to maybe 20% of normal. You get about 20 minutes of dim light before needing to replace them, and you're running through your battery supply at an alarming rate. Batteries hate cold, Mikhail observes unnecessarily. This is why we use kerosene lamps. Kerosene always works. The kerosene lamps are brilliantly simple: a reservoir of fuel, a wick, and a glass chimney to protect the flame and increase brightness via the draft effect. No batteries, no electronics, no components that can freeze or fail. The lamps provide both light and a small amount of heat, though you have to be careful about ventilation because they consume oxygen and produce carbon monoxide. But they work at minus 90 degrees Celsius just as well as they work at plus 20 degrees Celsius, which is more than you can say for any flashlight. Communication technology is perhaps the most frustrating failure. The village has a cell tower, though tower is generous. It's more of a pole with equipment bolted to it, and the signal is weak and intermittent even in good conditions. In extreme cold, it often stops working entirely. The metal components contract, connections loosen, and the electronics that manage the signal processing simply can't operate reliably at these temperatures. You've learned to check your phone, back when it worked, only when indoors, near the stove, where the warmth might coax it into temporary functionality. Internet connectivity, provided by a satellite link, is even worse. The satellite dish requires periodic de-icing because even in the extreme cold, breath vapor from the village can freeze onto surfaces and build up into ice layers that block signal. Someone has to climb up periodically and chip the ice away, a task that's exactly as miserable as it sounds. And when the system works, the connection is slow, expensive, and prone to dropouts. Streaming video is impossible. Loading a simple web page can take minutes. The internet exists here in theory more than practice. Mikhail's watch is mechanical, an ancient Soviet-era wind-up model with a face so scratched you can barely read the numbers. But it works. Digital watches freeze, batteries die, LCD screens stop working, he explains. This watch belonged to my grandfather. Worked in winter then, works now. Will work for my grandchildren. The watch's mechanical heart, metal springs and gears operating through purely physical principles, is immune to the cold in ways electronic devices can never be. The village's water pumping system is heated and insulated, but it still fails regularly. The pumps themselves are mechanical and robust, but the electrical systems that control them are temperamental in the extreme cold. When the pumps fail, people revert to the old method, chopping through river ice and hauling water manually. It's brutal work, but it's also foolproof. Gravity and human muscle power don't stop functioning at minus 74 degrees Celsius. You witness a particularly dramatic technological failure when a small aircraft attempts to land at the village airstrip. The plane is one of the few that still operate flights in winter, bringing mail, medical supplies, and the occasional passenger crazy enough to visit. But today, in minus 76 degrees Celsius air, the plane's hydraulic fluid has thickened to the point where the landing gear won't deploy properly. The pilot circles, trying to warm the system, but eventually has to abort the landing and return to Yakutsk. The supplies will have to wait for warmer weather, which is to say, temperatures above minus 60 degrees Celsius, when hydraulic fluid will function again. Cameras are another casualty. You brought a decent digital camera, hoping to document your experience, but it's become almost useless. The LCD screen doesn't work in the cold. The battery drains within minutes. The lubricants in the autofocus mechanism have thickened, causing the motor to grind and fail. Even the mechanical shutter struggles, clicking sluggishly or jamming entirely. The few photos you've managed to take required bringing the camera inside to warm it, shooting quickly before it cooled again, and accepting that maybe one shot in 5 would actually work. Mikhail shows you his camera, a fully mechanical Soviet Zenit from the 1970s, built like a tank and operating on purely mechanical principles. No batteries, no electronics, no LCD screen. Just gears, springs, and optical glass. "This camera works," he says simply. "Took picture in winter. Takes pictures now. Took my father's wedding picture in minus 65 degrees Celsius. Your fancy camera." He gestures dismissively at your expensive DSLR. Expensive garbage in cold. The plastics and rubbers in modern devices become brittle in extreme cold, prone to cracking and shattering. You watch in horror as a water bottle, a nice insulated one you brought from home, develops a crack when you set it down too firmly on a frozen surface. The bottle, which cost you $40, is now garbage. Mikhail's water container is made from metal, wrapped in leather. It's dented, scratched, and ugly, but it's also unbreakable. Even something as simple as a zipper becomes a technological challenge. The metal zippers on your modern jacket can freeze solid, especially if any moisture has gotten into the mechanism. You've learned to treat zippers with powdered graphite, which provides lubrication without freezing, but even then, they can stick and jam. The traditional Saka clothing often uses toggles and ties instead of zippers. Simpler, more reliable, impossible to freeze solid. Historians still argue about whether pre-industrial societies were more resilient than modern ones, or whether we've just traded old vulnerabilities for new ones. Here in Oymyakon, the answer seems clear. Modern technology has made life more comfortable in temperate climates, but it's made us more fragile in extreme environments. The people who survived here for centuries before electricity didn't have batteries to die or electronics to freeze. They had fire, mechanical tools, and knowledge, all of which work at any temperature. One evening, the village's power fails completely. The diesel generator has frozen despite all precautions, and repairs will take hours, maybe days. Mikhail barely reacts. He lights the kerosene lamps, adds wood to the stove, and life continues essentially unchanged. For you, it's disorienting. No lights except the flickering lamps, no phone, no internet, no electrical anything. For Mikhail's family, it's just Tuesday. They've lived through these failures before and will again. "You people are addicted to electricity," Mikhail observes, watching you struggle with the adjustment. "We use electricity, yes, when it works, but we don't need it to survive. Your whole world stops when power stops. Our world keeps going." He's right, and the realization is humbling. You've brought technological solutions to what is fundamentally a primal challenge. Staying warm, finding food, surviving darkness. And your technology has failed comprehensively, defeated by simple thermodynamics. The modern world, with all its sophisticated tools and devices, has nothing to offer here that works better than fire, fur, and human resilience. Your laptop is dead. Your phone is dead. Your camera barely functions. Your headlamp is useless. But the kerosene lamp burns steadily, the mechanical clock ticks reliably, and the wood stove radiates heat that keeps you alive. The scorecard is clear. Technology 0, traditional methods. Still undefeated. You wrap yourself in reindeer fur, sit closer to the stove, and accept that for the next few months, you're living in a world that would be recognizable to someone from the 19th century, possibly earlier. And you know what? You're surviving just fine. The void doesn't need Wi-Fi to be void. And neither do you. Around week 10, you start seeing things that aren't there. Nothing dramatic. Just small movements at the edge of your vision. Shadows that shift when they shouldn't. The sense that someone just walked past you when you're alone in the room. You mention this hesitantly to Mikhail, worried that you're losing your mind, and he nods as if you've just told him you have a headache. Polar madness, he says matter-of-factly. Happens to everyone first winter. Brain doesn't like darkness this long. Starts making things up. He pours you tea, the ritual response to all problems here. My first winter, I was maybe 8 years old. I was convinced there was a second family living in the walls of our house. Could hear them talking, moving around. Drove my mother crazy asking about them. After a few weeks, they went away. You're experiencing what psychologists call sensory deprivation hallucinations, a phenomenon well documented in extreme environments, polar stations, submarines, solitary confinement. Your brain, evolved to process constant sensory input from a varied environment, is being starved of stimulation. The darkness eliminates most visual information. The cold keeps you indoors, restricting movement and environmental variation. The social circle is tiny and repetitive. Your brain, desperate for novelty, starts generating its own. The hallucinations are usually benign. Fleeting shapes, brief sounds, the sensation of presence. But they're unsettling precisely because you know they're not real yet can't stop perceiving them. You find yourself turning quickly to catch the shadow person who just walked behind you, only to find empty space. You hear conversations in the wind outside, entire dialogues in voices you almost recognize. Your brain is trying to fill the void with something, anything, to maintain the illusion of a populated, complex world. But the hallucinations are just the surface manifestation of something deeper and more troubling. The psychological weight of the polar night is accumulating, pressing down on you with increasing force. By week 11, you're experiencing full-blown seasonal affective disorder, and it's worse than you imagined. You wake up exhausted despite sleeping 10 or 11 hours. Getting out of your sleeping area requires enormous effort, as if gravity has increased overnight. Simple tasks, getting dressed, eating breakfast, having a conversation, feel like they require more energy than you possess. Your mood has darkened in ways that go beyond simple sadness. There's a flatness to everything, an emotional numbness that makes it hard to care about anything. Food tastes like cardboard. Conversations feel pointless. The activities that Mikhail's family engages in, carving wood, sewing, telling stories, seem utterly meaningless to you. You're experiencing anhedonia, the inability to feel pleasure, a core symptom of depression that no amount of rational self-talk can overcome. Sarjalana notices. She always notices. You need more light, she says, bringing you the light therapy device again, standing over you to make sure you actually use it. 30 minutes. Every morning. No arguing. Her tone brooks no disagreement. The light helps marginally, but it feels like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teaspoon. The darkness is too vast, too complete, too overwhelming for a small LED panel to meaningfully counteract. The isolation amplifies everything. You're thousands of kilometers from anyone you know, cut off by failed technology and impassable roads from the wider world. The social circle consists of perhaps 15 people you see regularly, and while they're kind, there's a cultural and linguistic barrier that prevents deep connection. You're profoundly alone in a way you've never experienced before, alone in your own head with thoughts that are becoming increasingly dark and intrusive. Around week 12, you start having intrusive thoughts about freezing. Not suicidal ideation exactly, but something close. A fascination with how easy it would be to just step outside, walk away from the village, and let the cold do its work. You'd be unconscious from hypothermia within 20 minutes, dead within an hour, and all of this, the darkness, the isolation, the grinding psychological weight, would be over. The thoughts terrify you, but they keep returning, intrusive and unwanted. Your brain apparently exploring this option with morbid curiosity. You don't tell anyone about these thoughts. You're ashamed of them, worried that voicing them would make them real. But you start to understand the statistics you read before coming here, the elevated suicide rates in Arctic communities, the mental health crises that peak during the polar night. This isn't weakness or personal failing. This is biochemistry gone haywire, serotonin depletion, circadian rhythm chaos, and social isolation combining into a psychological perfect storm that overwhelms normal coping mechanisms. Mikhail's family has their own strategies for managing the psychological toll. The evening gatherings around the stove aren't just about warmth. They're structured social time, mandatory connection that prevents people from retreating completely into isolation. The storytelling, the communal meals, the shared labor. These are all psychological prophylaxis against the darkness. Nobody is allowed to be alone with their thoughts for too long. Winter is hardest month 3 and 4. Mikhail says one evening, apparently reading your deteriorating state. First month, you're still strong, still have hope. Second month, you're tired but managing. Month 3 and 4, January, February, this is when people break. Sun is still far away. Darkness feels permanent, and body is exhausted from fighting cold. This is when you must be most careful. He's describing exactly what you're experiencing. You're in month 3 now, and the awareness that there's still another 6 or 7 weeks of this ahead feels crushing. You cannot imagine surviving another week, let alone another month and a half. Time has become elastic and torturous. Days drag by with excruciating slowness. Yet when you look back, entire weeks have vanished into an undifferentiated blur of darkness and cold. Your sleep has become disordered in ways that go beyond simple insomnia. You're having vivid, disturbing dreams, nightmares about freezing, about being buried in snow, about the sun never returning. You wake multiple times per night in states of confusion, unsure whether you're awake or still dreaming, sometimes unsure where you are or what year it is. The temporal disorientation from the constant darkness has invaded your sleep, creating a state where waking and sleeping blur into each other. The physical symptoms are accumulating too. You've developed a persistent low-grade headache that never quite goes away. Your immune system seems depressed. You've had a cold that's lingered for 3 weeks, never quite bad enough to be seriously ill, but never quite clearing up either. Your joints ache constantly. You're gaining weight despite being more physically active, your body desperately trying to insulate itself, overriding all normal metabolic regulation. Adelina, surprisingly, becomes a source of unexpected comfort. She seems to sense your struggle in the way that children sometimes do, and she starts including you in her activities, teaching you a traditional Saka children's game, showing you how to braid leather cords, asking for help with her homework. Her presence forces you out of your own head, demands engagement with something beyond your internal darkness. You're grateful for her in ways you can't articulate. One particularly bad day, when you can barely summon the will to get out of bed, Oksana shuffles over and sits beside you. She doesn't speak. She doesn't need to. She just sits there, a tiny ancient presence, and after a few minutes she starts humming. It's a traditional Saka song, wordless and haunting, and there's something about it. The melody, the vibration, her calm presence, that cuts through the fog slightly. You don't feel better exactly, but you feel less alone. Later, Mikhail translates her words. She says darkness is like deep water. If you fight it, you drown. If you relax and float, you survive until you reach shore. Stop fighting. Just float. Spring will come. The concept of floating through the darkness becomes your primary survival strategy. You stop trying to maintain your normal energy levels. Stop beating yourself up for the depression and lethargy. You accept that this is what winter is, a low-energy, low-mood state that's a reasonable response to impossible conditions. You sleep when you're tired, which is often. You eat when you're hungry, which is constantly. You sit by the stove and stare at nothing and accept that this is okay. This is survival, this is enough. The village has a small community center that opens sporadically when power is available, and they organize social events specifically to combat the psychological toll of winter. You attend one, a gathering where people play instruments, sing songs, drink tea, and share food. The room is crowded, warm, loud with conversation and laughter. It's a deliberate assault on the isolation and silence of winter, and it helps. For a few hours, the darkness outside feels less oppressive. But there's a darker side to the polar night psychology that nobody talks about openly. Domestic violence increases. Alcohol abuse spikes. Marriages that were fine in summer develop cracks in winter's pressure. The close quarters, the inability to escape, the accumulated stress. It all creates a pressure cooker environment. You overhear arguments through thin walls, raised voices in Russian that you don't fully understand but whose anger is unmistakable. One morning, you see a woman with a bruise on her face that she won't explain. The darkness doesn't just affect individuals. It stresses entire social systems to the breaking point. Mikhail admits quietly one night that he and Sargelana fight more in winter. Nothing serious, he says. But small things become big. She gets angry I don't help enough. I get angry she criticizes. In summer, we laugh about these things. In winter, they feel important, feel like reasons to stay angry. He pauses, staring at the stove. Winter tests marriages. Some don't survive. The psychological research on polar communities has documented something called winter-over syndrome, a constellation of symptoms including depression, insomnia, irritability, and cognitive impairment that affects people living in polar regions during the dark months. It's not a formal diagnosis, but it's a recognized phenomenon, affecting even modern research stations in Antarctica with all their psychological screening and support systems. Here in Oymyakon, with no psychologists, no support groups, no mental health infrastructure, people simply endure it, some better than others. You're beginning to understand why some people never make it through their first winter here, why workers brought in from other parts of Russia sometimes flee midwinter despite the difficulty of leaving, why the population of these far northern communities trends downward as young people move away and don't return. The physical cold is survivable, difficult, but manageable with the right gear and knowledge. The psychological cold is something else entirely, an assault on the mind and spirit that no amount of preparation can fully shield against. Around week 14, you hit what feels like rock bottom. You're lying in your sleeping area in the middle of what might be afternoon, might be evening. You've stopped caring about time, and you realize you can't remember what colors look like in sunlight. You know intellectually that grass is green, that the sky is blue, but you can't conjure the actual experience of those colors. Your visual memory has been bleached by darkness, leaving only the memory of memories, second-hand knowledge of a world that seems increasingly fictional. You cry for the first time since arriving, quietly so as not to disturb the family. You cry for the son you've forgotten, for the life you left behind, for the person you were before the darkness began its work. You cry from exhaustion and desperation and the awful realization that you still have more than a month of this ahead before spring even begins to approach. Sargelana finds you there, red-eyed and miserable. She doesn't say anything, just brings you tea and sits beside you. After a while, she says quietly in halting English, "Spring comes, always comes. Even when you stop believing, spring comes. You just have to not die before it arrives." It's the most honest thing anyone has said to you about winter. Not inspirational, not comforting exactly, just true. Survive. Don't die. Spring will handle the rest. And so you float, as Oksana advised, through the deepest darkness, through the worst of the psychological assault, through days that blur into nights that blur into something that isn't quite either. You take your antidepressant, brought from home, one thing modern medicine offers that actually helps. You use the light therapy device. You force yourself to eat and sleep and engage with people even when it feels pointless. You survive, because the alternative, giving in to the darkness, letting it win, isn't actually an option. Spring will come. It has to, because if it doesn't, none of this means anything. But spring will come. You just have to live long enough to see it. The first sign that something is changing comes in mid-February, and you almost miss it. You're sitting by the window during what passes for midday, staring blankly at the darkness as has become your habit. When you notice something impossible, the quality of the black has shifted. It's not lighter exactly, calling it light would be generous, but there's a texture to it now, a gradation from absolute void to something that might charitably be called extremely dark gray. The horizon, invisible for months, has a suggestion of definition. Sun is coming back, Adalina announces, appearing beside you. Can't see it yet, but it's getting closer. She says this with the absolute certainty of someone who's witnessed this resurrection every year of her life. For you, it's almost impossible to believe. The darkness has been so complete, so total, for so long that the concept of it ending feels like a fairy tale. Mikhail confirms it with his pocket calendar, marked with celestial calculations. February 20th, sun will show above horizon for first time, just for a few minutes, but every day after a little longer. He grins at your expression. Thought you'd never see sun again, yes? Everyone thinks this first winter, but sun always comes back. Has for 4 billion years. Won't stop for you. The days, you can almost call them days now, begin to stretch. By late February, you're getting almost 5 hours of something resembling daylight, though daylight is a generous term for the weak, anemic glow that barely penetrates the perpetual twilight. But compared to the 20 hours of absolute darkness you've endured, it feels like a searchlight has been turned on. Your body responds before your mind fully processes what's happening. You wake up one morning in early March and realize you slept through the night. Actual consolidated sleep, not the fragmented, tortured dozing that's been your norm for months. Your appetite shifts subtly. You're still hungry, but the desperate, never-satisfied quality has eased. The headache that's been your constant companion fades to occasional instead of permanent. The depression begins to lift, though lift makes it sound graceful when it's actually messy and uneven. You have good days and bad days, moments of hope followed by crashes back into despair. But the trajectory is upward, undeniable. By mid-March, you're getting 7 hours of daylight, and the sun, when you can actually see it, is noticeably higher in the sky, stronger, more insistent. The village transforms as light returns. People emerge from their homes more frequently, spend longer periods outside. Conversations happen in daylight for the first time in months. Children play in the snow, actual play, not just necessary movement but joyful activity. The horses, shaggy and winter-worn, seem more animated, moving around their enclosures instead of just standing in stoic endurance. On March 21st, the spring equinox, you experience 12 hours of daylight for the first time since September. 12 hours. Half the day illuminated. It feels like an embarrassment of riches, like someone has switched on stadium lights after months of stumbling through darkness with a dying candle. You stand outside at noon, face tilted to the sun, and feel actual warmth on your skin for the first time in months. It's probably only minus 45 degrees Celsius, still cold enough to kill you with prolonged exposure, but it feels tropical compared to what you've survived. Tears freeze on your face before you realize you're crying. But these aren't the desperate, hopeless tears from January. These are relief, gratitude, and the physical manifestation of something breaking inside you. Not breaking down, but breaking open. The darkness hasn't killed you. You've made it. You've survived. Mikhail finds you there, face turned sunward, frozen tears on your cheeks. Good crying or bad crying? He asks. Good. You manage? Definitely good. He nods, satisfied. First spring is special. You earned it. Not everyone makes it to spring intact. It's unclear whether he means physically or psychologically, but probably both. The return of light triggers changes throughout the natural world that you're only beginning to notice. The birds return first. Ravens and crows that have been absent for months. They're cawing a raucous announcement that life is resuming. Then smaller birds, species you don't recognize, filling the air with calls that seem impossibly loud after the silence of winter. The horses begin to shed their massive winter coats in huge clumps, revealing the sleeker animals underneath. Even the dogs, lean and quiet through the winter, become more energetic and playful. The human world responds too. People begin preparing for the work that can only happen in spring and summer, repairing roofs, fixing fences, planting gardens. The brief months of warmth and light must be used efficiently because winter will return with the same inevitability that spring has arrived. There's no time to waste celebrating. There's too much work to do. You help Mikhail with spring tasks, your body still adapting to the longer days and increased activity. The wood that was cut last summer and burned through winter needs to be replaced. Trees must be felled, cut, split, and stacked, thousands of kilograms of it, to ensure survival next winter. The summer garden needs planning and preparation, though actual planting won't happen until late May when the soil finally thaws enough to work. The permafrost is both blessing and curse now. The ground remains frozen solid even as the air temperature rises above freezing, which means the surface becomes a muddy, treacherous mess of standing water with nowhere to drain. The village turns into a swamp of mud and slush, with people wearing massive rubber boots that make them look like they're walking on small platforms. Spring is beautiful, Sargelana says drily, watching you slip and nearly fall in the mud, but also disgusting. By April, you're getting 15 hours of daylight, and the temperature has risen to a balmy -20 degrees Celsius during the day, occasionally even approaching -10 degrees Celsius. The transformation is remarkable. Ice on the river begins to crack and shift, producing booming sounds that echo across the landscape. Water appears, running water, liquid water, for the first time in 7 months. Small streams emerge from melting snow, creating a soundscape of trickling and burbling that seems miraculous after the profound silence of winter. The psychological shift is as dramatic as the physical one. The village, which felt like a collection of isolated survival bunkers during winter, becomes a community again. People visit each other not out of survival necessity but for social pleasure. Laughter becomes common again. Children are everywhere, released from the constraints of extreme cold, playing games and exploring with the boundless energy of young humans who've been cooped up too long. You notice changes in yourself that go beyond mood improvement. You're thinking more clearly, processing information faster, making decisions with confidence instead of the foggy uncertainty that characterized winter. You're remembering things, not just recent events, but older memories that seem to have been locked away by the darkness. Colors look vivid, almost hallucinogenic in their intensity after months of seeing only the muted palette of lamplight and darkness. Oksana tells you, through Mikhail's translation, that you have winter eyes now, the look of someone who's survived their first polar night. You came here looking soft, city soft, she says, peering at your face. Now you look like you've fought something and won. Different person. Stronger person, but also damaged person. Winter does this. Takes something from you, gives something else back. You understand what she means. You've lost something in the darkness. A certain innocence about your own resilience. A casual assumption that you could handle anything. A belief that the modern world's comforts make you invulnerable. But you've gained something too. A profound appreciation for light, for warmth, for the simple fact of being alive. You'll never again take sunrise for granted. You'll never again complain about a cloudy day. You know now, in your bones, what true darkness feels like, and everything else is brilliance by comparison. By late April, daylight extends to nearly 18 hours, and the sun at midnight barely dips below the horizon, creating a perpetual twilight that never quite becomes night. The white nights of spring are approaching, the inverse of the polar night. Soon the sun won't set at all for weeks, creating its own challenges as your body tries to remember how to sleep when it's never truly dark. The temperature reaches 0 degrees Celsius in early May, and you witness water in its liquid state outdoors for the first time in 8 months. It's oddly emotional, watching ice melt, seeing puddles form, hearing the drip 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 of water from roofs. The physics is simple, molecular bonds breaking as thermal energy increases, but it feels like magic, like the resurrection of something dead. The final proof that you've truly survived comes when the first green appears. Grass, impossibly green against the brown and white landscape, pushing up through the thawing soil. It's just grass, the most common plant on Earth, but you stare at it like it's an alien artifact. You kneel down and touch it, feeling the living plant under your fingers, and something in you that's been frozen since October finally thaws completely. Mikhail finds you there, kneeling in the mud, touching grass and crying again. He doesn't comment on the crying. You've become a much more emotional person through winter, and he's learned to just let it happen. Green is good color, he observes. Means food is coming, warmth is coming, easy time is coming. Winter will return, always does. But for now, we get to live instead of just survive. You stand up, muddy-kneed and tear-stained, and look around at the village that's been your prison and salvation. The houses that seemed so fragile in winter now look sturdy and reliable. The people who were just survival partners have become something like family. The landscape that was hostile and deadly has revealed a harsh beauty that you've learned to appreciate. I understand now, you tell Mikhail, why people stay, why you don't leave. He nods slowly. Most people who visit, they see only the cold, the darkness, the difficulty. They don't understand we're not trapped here. We're adapted here. This place made us who we are. Leaving would be leaving ourselves. As May progresses toward June, the transformation continues. Flowers appear, tiny Arctic wildflowers in impossible colors, bright against the still brown earth. Birds nest. The river, fully thawed now, flows fast and clean. Mosquitoes emerge in clouds thick enough to obscure vision, and you discover that summer in Yakutia has its own challenges. Swarms of insects so dense they can suffocate small animals. Heat that can reach 30 degrees Celsius, creating a temperature swing of over 100 degrees from winter lows, and the constant activity required to prepare for the next winter. But these are problems for a different season. Right now, in late May, with 22 hours of daylight and temperatures hovering around 15 degrees Celsius, you're simply reveling in having survived the unsurvivable. You're thinner than when you arrived, but stronger. Your face is weathered, lines around your eyes that weren't there before. Your hands are calloused and scarred. You've lost some toes to minor frostbite. Nothing serious, just the tips of your smallest toes, blackened and eventually amputated. Physical marks of winter's claim on you. But you're alive. You've survived minus 71 degrees Celsius. You've survived 20 hours of darkness per day. You've survived the psychological assault of the polar night, the physical brutality of the extreme cold, the isolation, the equipment failures, the hunger, the fear, and the moments when you weren't sure you could survive another hour, let alone another month. The summer solstice arrives on June 21st, and the sun doesn't set at all, just circles the horizon in an endless loop, creating a day that lasts 24 hours. You stay up all night watching it, this thing you once took completely for granted, this burning ball of fusion fire that makes all life possible. At 2 a.m., when the sun is at its lowest point but still clearly visible above the horizon, you finally understand viscerally what you've survived. You survived the absence of this, the absence of warmth, of light, of the energy that makes the world livable. You survived because of knowledge accumulated over generations, because of technology both ancient and modern, because of the kindness of people who had no obligation to help you, and because of something in you that refused to give up even when giving up seemed entirely reasonable. Now the wind shifts gently, carrying the scent of warming earth and growing things. You take a deep breath, in through your nose, slow and controlled, a habit that will probably never leave you, and the air is warm enough not to hurt. Birds are singing. Children are playing. The stove inside Mikhail's house is burning low, barely necessary, a symbolic flame more than a survival tool. Spring has returned. The sun has returned. Life has returned. And against all odds, despite everything winter threw at you, you've returned too. Not unchanged, but intact enough to tell the story, to remember the darkness, and to appreciate the light with an intensity that people who haven't survived the polar night can never quite understand. The darkness took something from you, but you took something back, the knowledge that you can survive what seems unsurvivable, that the human spirit is resilient beyond imagining, and that spring always, eventually, impossibly, miraculously returns. You turn away from the midnight sun and walk back toward the house, toward warmth and tea and the family that kept you alive when you couldn't keep yourself alive. Tomorrow you'll help with the garden. Next week you'll help repair the roof. In 4 months you'll help stack wood for next winter. Because winter will return. It always does. But now you know the secret that the Saka people have known for centuries. Winter is not the enemy. Winter is just winter. And if you survive it with knowledge, community, and stubborn determination, spring waits on the other side. And spring, after that particular winter, is the most beautiful thing you've ever seen. The midnight sun hangs low on the horizon, painting the landscape in soft gold and pink. The village is quiet now, but it's a different quiet than winter's oppressive silence. This is peace, contentment, the exhale after a held breath. You stand in the threshold of Mikhail's home, 1 foot in, 1 foot out, balanced between the world you survived and the world you're returning to. Inside, the stove crackles softly. Sarjalana hums a traditional melody as she prepares tea. Adalina is already asleep, sprawled across her bed with the abandon of childhood. Oksana sits by the window, her ancient face tilted toward the light, eyes closed, absorbing the warmth like a solar battery recharging after months of darkness. You realize you're smiling, not a forced smile, not a polite smile, but a genuine expression of something that feels suspiciously like joy. You've survived minus 71 degrees Celsius. You've survived the polar night. You've survived Oymyakon in winter, and that survival has changed you in ways you're only beginning to understand. The darkness will return in 4 months. The cold will return. The 20-hour nights will return. But you know now that they're temporary, that the wheel turns, that spring follows winter with the inevitability of breath following breath. Outside, a bird calls. Some Arctic species you still can't identify, but its song is clear and bright in the endless twilight. The sound carries across the thawing landscape, a small voice proclaiming the simple, profound truth that life continues, that warmth returns, that nothing, not even the deepest darkness, lasts forever. You step fully inside, letting the door close behind you, sealing in the warmth and light and the gentle sounds of people you've come to love. Tomorrow is another day, a long one, stretching 22 hours of sunlight, filled with work and warmth and the 1,000 small miracles of summer in a place that shouldn't be habitable but is. Tonight, though, tonight you'll just sit by the window with tea and watch the sun refuse to set, grateful beyond words for light, for warmth, for the stubborn persistence of life in the coldest corner of the inhabited earth. Sweet dreams wait beyond the darkness. You've earned them, and the sun, eternal and indifferent and absolutely essential, continues its slow circle across the sky, keeping promises it never made, returning as it always has, as it always will, faithful in the only way that matters. Welcome back to the light. You've survived the void, and the void, for all its power, couldn't keep you.